if you're going to go in a cave, you need to be prepared for what you're going to do, because if you're not, the consequences can be quite serious. If you're lucky, you survive it. If you're unprepared, but people die in caves. People that are unprepared. People that are prepared occasionally die in caves due to circumstances either beyond their control or something they just didn't plan for that occurs. We constantly preach safety to our members here, and tell them, you just can't get lackadaisical about it. You got to follow up on it, and it's like work. You have to have a safe work environment. When you're going caving, you still have to have a safe caving environment. And well, the smart caver says, "Gee, I need thus and so to do this, and I don't have it." And they stop and turn around and come back another day and better prepared. The foolhardy say, "Oh, well, I think I can do this without that," and occasionally we carry them out of the cave. And or they get careless and we carry them out of the cave. I've only been on 1 or 2 body recoveries as a cave rescuer, and I've been on a few successful rescues where we were able to bring the patient out of the cave and get them treatment or get them whatever care they needed, whether it would have been they were lost and just couldn't find their way out. That's happened a couple of times. And so it happens, and that's one of the reasons we make maps, is to try and keep people from getting lost in the first place.
And also there was one further thing. I never got to think about that. I never got to develop that idea, and I haven't even now, but I know, I just sense that people are going to be different because of playing these games, because of writing email, because of putting their personality into email. You know how people put on personas? At that time, email was a game, and people would write to each other and put on, well, I can only say persona. So it was like play acting. The email was play acting. There was a wonderful emailer. Her name was Arwen, Lady Arwen, and there was a guy who took on the name of Strider, and it was all just a game. It was all a lot of fun with that, and to see people interact, knowing this is going to change people. It's not that just that we're playing the games, but by playing these kind of games, we're going to be different people. And I am sure that young people today are different from my generation, who grew up right at the point when television started. Like, I'm 55, I was born in 1952, and I can't remember how old we were when we got a TV, but there was no TV before that. Can you imagine not having TV? Your life would be different, and we were different because of that. Because of watching TV and not sitting down, like when I was a little girl, what you did in the evening is you sat down and you read books. You looked at your picture books, and you did that all evening, and you talked with each other. There were good things and bad things about that. But it's certainly having the television where everybody sat and watched TV, that changed people. And I'm just convinced that kids who have grown up using computers all the time for daily tasks as a tool, that the tool has also changed them. Yeah, I think that might have been the most important question for me, was how is this going to change people? What's it like to play a game? What's it like to write a letter and get an immediate response to it, and you put yourself out as one type of person, and you don't have to be that to the next person you write to. It was just really, really fun and exciting at that time. It was just different, I think. It wasn't a tool that you use only for writing memos. It was actually unusual to write memos at the time using computers. There weren't that many people who used computers.
It was on the PDP-10. I think it was the DM machine. It was on the ARPANET. Mark was the primary driver, really, in terms of he wrote probably more code than anybody else did, and more of the text strings, that sort of thing. And he was a very close friend of mine. I remember being at the Lab for Computer Science one night, and he was in God mode. He would now and then just go in and start playing with people's minds, and he could type so rapidly that he could look like he was the game. And so people would try something, and he would type a response and see what happened, and sometimes get an idea for a new puzzle or a new solution or whatever, and go off and start coding it.
One of my favorite bugs that I remember fairly vividly was around the typical drink bottle kind of thing. Somewhere in the Deadly Summer game, there's a kitchen table, and there's a bottle of water somewhere in the kitchen or on the table or something like that. And testing out the slightly improved English language parsing of Better Than Zork. Most other games, you would typically say something like drink bottle, and that was an oversimplification, which would be understood to mean drink the water out of the bottle, and now you have an empty bottle, and you've drunk the water, and you've shrunk, or you died, or you feel refreshed or something. In the Better Than Zork engine for the Deadly Summer game, when I tried it, I did drink bottle rather than drink water from bottle, drink water in bottle. And it said you drank the bottle. Now the bottle's gone. I actually drank the bottle. So I thought to myself, that seems wrong. And I started to file a bug on that. And I said, well, let me see what else I can drink. Drink table. I actually drank the table. Proceeded to drink a bunch of items in the room. I think I drank a chair, and I was able to drink some stuff out of my inventory. Finally, I said, drink me. And then I find myself in this empty room, and there's all my stuff.
Nowadays, everybody has the collector mentality. eBay has really done that to our culture, I think. Back then, I'm sure nobody was thinking that 15, 20, 25 years from now, that any of these Infocom packages with all their little props and trinkets would be worth anything to anybody. I'm sure they weren't even considering that back then. It's fun to go looking for items that existed, but it's even more fun to come across something that you never knew existed. I have a multi-page list of items that I would love to own someday. I will basically be collecting until the day I die. It's fun to have them, to take them down and look at them and show people this is how games used to be, this is how the game industry used to be. The disc media will eventually deteriorate over time and become unreadable. When you look back at vintage items from the 1940s or 50s, vintage toys from that era, I guess you can kind of use the conditions you typically find those boxes in as kind of a benchmark to go from, as far as the packaging for computer software from the 80s. Figuring about in another 50, 60 years, it'll probably look along those lines. Maybe a little better if I've done my job here preserving it well.
One thing I can say about text is that it's infinitely flexible. It's easy to splice in a word like 16 as opposed to 6. To say there were 16 things on the table as opposed to there were 6 things on the table. And you can visualize it. It's a lot harder to draw 16 things appropriately on a table than it is to draw 6. Because with 6, you can place them in exact locations. Not so with 16. Or what if there's 37 and a half? You can do that in text. The flexibility is almost infinite.
Our case was like, where'd you guys go? We thought you were doing so well. What happened? One of the problems with running your own business is you also are running your own problems, and it it's nice being able to sleep at night and not worrying about things. Ultimately, what happened to Adventure International is my fault. I was the president of the company, and I made ultimate decisions. I'm sure I listened to some bad advice. I probably did not choose the best people to be working with me in all areas, but ultimately, the blame was all mine for the ultimate problems we had. What basically happened, since we're talking about that, was our pockets were not deep. We were not a public company. We had no outside money, and we were just totally funded internally and with our growth. We hit a bad turn in sales where we accepted some orders that were exceptionally large from a company that we filled, and they did not sell through, and they returned the merchandise, which left us with a lot of manufacturing costs because they didn't meet their deals. Also, remember the time that the TI-99-4 went from being a $1,000 computer to a $50 computer when they were closing it out. There was a big downturn in the industry at that time. We didn't have the pockets to survive it. We didn't have any outside investors, and that was basically a downhill slide at that point. Also, we had sold out some of our lines to Commodore Computer. They were actually publishing our Marvel lines, and they did really a very poor job of it, and they were unable to meet their commitments to us on what they had promised. Fortunately, it was a three-way contract with them, Marvel, and ourselves, and at least they were able to, we got some of the penalty money out of them, but it was nowhere near what they had promised to do. So that hurt us. And without funding to ride the bumps, it's pretty bad.
People would always say, well, okay, what's the next step? You know, what's the next thing you can do? And it really wasn't clear to me. Okay, you can make the writing better, and you can make puzzles that are interesting, but as far as pushing more toward a more interactive real story, I mean, a real story, you don't just give everyone commands, right, and orders.
The goal always was for them to surprise you and to have more life. I'm not sure we ever really got there.
That it was too open-ended, that it was hard to know where to go with it and what was going to be the interesting part of it. Or were you turning it into a simulation where you're just building a big world you can wander around in, but not much happens?
To me, at least, what you'd really like is sort of the Turing test, something that passes the Turing test. You know, you want to be having a conversation with a computer where it could just as well be a conversation with a person running the other side of the game.
And ultimately, we realized that you need to have people, connected in networked worlds to really get there. But it was something that we tried to do with characters as well.
I think that what you have now is a really interesting simulation of an ideal that we all have in mind for what these things ought to be like, and it's not we haven't ever really built the ideal kind of game.
But for a person who thinks of interactive fiction as being a kind of immersive 3D virtual world physics engine with objects which can bang into each other in space and energy that can be directed against matter, if they think of it in that way, they're going to feel put upon, constantly limited, and they'll say, oh, this is a terribly primitive Baroque technology, instead of saying, wow, what a wonderfully sophisticated way of shaping a particular point of view, a particular experience.
This is something that has been critical to the success of literature for more than 1,000 years. The reason it's interesting to read the Odyssey and the Iliad has a great deal to do with how those stories are told, not just the things that happen in the stories, not just the incidents that are there, but also the way they're related, the way they're told.
And how do you deal with the fact that you've got story on the one hand, you've perhaps got puzzles on the other, and using puzzles as pacing elements? Well, if you're not going to use puzzles, then how do you pace things? How do you make something be more interactive, all of those kinds of issues that the community, and especially the academic side of the community, is wrestling with.
Internally at Infocom, we spend a lot of time discussing things like is second person the right person to be in for these games? Should the player character be left as much of a blank slate as possible, or is it okay, to say, you are Arthur Dent, instead of just you find yourself in this spot without explaining who you are or why.
I actually think that it would be a really neat tool for just aspiring writers, because in some sense, learning how to structure your story is a large part of your craft, and I think IF makes having to think about that structure much more explicit. I strongly suspect that getting the mental discipline to create the chains of events and the sort of logical connections of geography and objects to tell a story, probably, if you are used to doing that sort of disciplined layout of your story, is going to make your straight-up prose rather more readable. Do I know this? No, I'm completely talking out my ass, to be quite frank.
Well, I think there was kind of two directions there, like, say, with Plundered Hearts or the Sea Stalker, where we were trying to go down sort of familiar, literary paths, the Hardy Boys, romance novels, thinking that, the interactive fiction was the same market as books. All we had to do was just be in the different genres there, and how could it fail? On the other hand, you take something like, Mind Forever Voyaging, which was, very heavy science fiction, which even, say, as a science fiction book might have not appealed to a broad range of people. So, it was an unusual game. I mean, in some respects, it was all so new that I think it was kind of, who knew what was going to work at that point. I mean, the standard puzzle games certainly worked, but I think once you, wrote a few of those, you didn't want to keep writing, the same puzzle games over,
Interactive fiction shares in common with normal fiction, with non-computer-based fiction, that you have to keep in mind. For example, bad interactive fiction writing tells the player how they feel about a situation. It tells you that you feel your spine tingling and it's awful and scary and everything. Good interactive fiction presents you with a scene that's very immersive and interesting, and you get that spine-tingling effect because of what you read and because the writing itself is very good.
Adventure is a good example of how you can tell a great story with very few words. Because the constraints of the technology and the constraints of the space, how little writing can you do to give somebody a sense that they're in a room with a candle, and there's a rusty iron gate. Fill in the blanks. We end up remaking essentially Die Hard as a paradigm action film. Why we remake that movie again and again. The one-man army as a core game design, which does not go away. Everybody wants to be the underdog who takes on an entire island full of bad guys with only a pistol and a knife. Those aren't great storytelling spaces. You really can't tell a lot of story in that environment. But that's a great guaranteed moneymaker for the industry, and so they're going to keep going back to that well again and again.
So there should always be something for the player to do, whether it's, and traditionally that's solving puzzles. It could be exploring the landscape. It could be finding out something the author has to say about something. But the player needs to be an active. It needs to be given control of something, and told to go at it.
The writing is one of the only things that you have, and you can't hide behind how cool your pictures are, or how cool your sound effects are, or whatever.
Art is alternate realities that are in some ways like the reality we experience, in some ways quite unlike it.
One of the things that we're coming to realize is that the old-time hardcore gamer, whom we always used to assume was our target audience, is in fact now a minority of the number of players. And the hardcore gamers don't care about story. You know, they want to blow stuff up as rapidly as possible and get the highest possible score so that they can brag about it to their friends. But in fact, there's a limited number of people who want to do that, and we're all trying to get money from that same crowd, when there's a much larger group of people who want to feel as if they have gone away to a wonderful place and are entitled to do exciting, interesting things once they get there.
And a lot of games only program the if, which is that main path I was talking about earlier. If the player does this and everything's right, then you do this and the game goes on. But there's always that else. What if the player doesn't do what you expected? What if he comes up with this weird idea, or that strange input, or that other, just off the wall thing that he wants to try, just to see if the game breaks, just to see, where the edges are. That's part of the fun of playing a text adventure. And that's part of the fun, it's a great deal of the fun that I had in creating them, is in that imagined dialogue with the player. So that at the end of the day, when the player does this very weird thing and he says, oh, nobody would ever think of trying this, and then he says, oh my goodness, there's a non-default response there. The author actually thought about that, and that helps form that bond between you and the author, and says, that guy's just as strange as I am. He and I think the same way. So,
which is probably probably a mistake that experienced designers would warn you against, to learn to design towards an economy of objects. But at the time, there was nothing I wouldn't describe. If I mentioned wet leaves on the concrete, then we have an object for wet leaves and an object for concrete, and it just balloons to hundreds and hundreds of objects that have no purpose except to just be looked at and provide a little description. But the end result is a pretty dense and richly textured world that people were able to get lost in.
Until now, all art, all such expressions have been what I call expository. I, as artist, simply dump my expression upon you as reader, audience, whatever. And the feeling all along was that the audience must not intrude upon the artistic purity of the work of art. And that's all well and good for all other media, but in the interactive medium, the truth lies in the interaction itself.
One of the things that I remember, and part of it is the effects of youth, is just how important we thought it was. I thought it was. The people that I work with, just powerful new medium.
The idea of combining writing and programming was like, wow, how can I do this for my whole life? It was great.
The act of game creation and coding are so linked in the text adventure world that for me it's very hard to separate the two.
It was not so much a case of the movie camera designer becoming an actor. It was more the case of the would-be actor who helps invent a movie camera and realizes, hey, this is going to help me act.
It just so fundamentally changed things to have the reader be the protagonist.
And we had big arguments inside Infocom about were these games, was it interactive fiction. I mean, some people were much more on the side of, no, this is a real art form. And some people were more on the side of, hey, these things are fun, they're games.
It is hard to get the basic idea across, because I think storytelling in general has been lost in our society.
It's not about storytelling in the sense of there being a single story which will be told a certain way. It is about there being a fictional world which can be explored, encountered.
Most people's idea of storytelling is, you give me a novel, you give me a movie, you give me a story, and I will read it, I might interpret it a little bit, but that's about the extent you're going to get from me. I'm a passive consumer of stories. And storytelling used to be such a profound part of our society.
You, as the player, are complicit in the story. You're not just passively accepting it from some artist who's trying to prove a point. You are choosing whether you want to prove that point or not. You are choosing whether you want this to be a good story or a bad story. You're choosing, in the best cases, what you want the story to be about and how it plays out, and the pacing and all of these things.
The video game is a very strange medium to tell stories in, because it's one that's totally riddled and fixed with these abstract and bizarre rule sets. You have things which make no sense at all. You have a monster you kill in the woods and it drops a golden bracelet. What is it doing with the golden bracelet? We really don't know. It's never explained. Bears drop diamonds out of their asses when you kill them. Nobody's explained these things. Who cares? We've learned to accept it because we play these games that are full of these crazy mechanics. We accept them because we buy into the worlds. We buy into the worlds because the worlds are grounded in stories. If the stories are good stories, then we will accept the absurdity of the mechanics.
In order to make IF that's really interesting, the author needs to be able to imagine themselves as not themselves. And that's not always a basic requirement of writing. But I do think it is a more basic requirement of IF.
With interactive fiction, you have to expect a much broader range of input. That might include different forms of grammar or dialect, or people referring to objects with spellings you didn't anticipate, American versus British spellings. There's just different ways of thinking about problems, of moving around. Some people will try to go to the other side of the room or examine a part of an object where you never considered that object as having parts, you just thought of it as a whole.
Every word that the program produces was hardwired into the code by the author. But you as the player get to be the director.
You know, if this is really an art form, like film, for example, then you'd really want to know how to create the entire work. And in filmmaking, you'd be able to understand how to work a camera, how to shoot, how to edit, how to really make the finished product. So for me, as a writer, I understood that I had to know how to program.
That's the creative part, in some sense. You think, oh, I'm going to have a troll, and he's going to do this and that and the other thing. That's very creative. But then there's the mechanics of making that troll exist in software. And some people would say that's creative too, because writing computer code is creative. I think of it as creative. I've been doing it a long time.
With interactive storytelling, once again, there is no one right way to do it, and so every designer has to decide for themselves exactly what level of freedom they want to give the player.
Why can't I fight the dragon successfully? Well, you happen to be a postal clerk and you don't have any way of fighting a dragon successfully. That's just the way this particular story is. That's the framework of this story. You can shape the character of the postal clerk somewhat in terms of what you decide to have the person do. The person can be something of a joker as you shape him or her and try lots of funny, crazy things as opposed to just straight-ahead problem solving. But there is a somewhat fixed nature to the story.
I mean, like, everybody knows how to write in some sense, but there are still plenty of guides for writers out there. So I think there's definitely value in producing guides for how to write IF, and it helps me to write my ideas out, right? Like, this is what I think a good IF game is, and I can take those ideas and put it up against something I'm writing and say, does this stand up? Does what I'm writing stand up to these rules, and do the rules stand up to what I'm writing? So there's benefits for me in writing that out. As a player, you need to learn how to express your thoughts to the game. The syntax in IF is not natural English, even though obviously people make a big point of it being so. It's a very limited subset of English with its own grammars, and even its own rules. Push is more common than move, which is more common than shove or something as a vocab word. So as an existing player, as an experienced player, you know to try push first and then move and then maybe shove if all else fails. But as a new player with no experience whatsoever, you don't have any way of distinguishing which of those words is more likely to work than the others.
That maturity of the form was an impediment, because you knew that there were hundreds of thousands of people out there who had played these games, and they knew that you're supposed to be able to do certain things, and they expect the plot as such to move in certain ways. You have to establish who you are, where you are. You have to kind of eventually figure out what the goal is. You have to figure out if this is going to be, what genre you're living in. Is this science fiction or is it, whatever. So that can be an impediment. It's kind of like if you're trying to do the latest version of CSI on television, you can't suddenly go off and completely change all the premises. Or if you're writing a script for Lost, you can't suddenly answer all the questions.
The parsers was mainly the things that they always pushed. They always used to push parsers and numbers of rooms. They'd say this game has got 5,000 rooms. Well, yes, it has, but that's basically 100 times 100 times however many of them they have. Actually, that would be 10,000 rooms. But they'd push things like that. They try to ramp up their metrics, and the parser was always the thing that the more sophisticated ones would yell about, which was always a surprise because I did my PhD in artificial intelligence, and the parsers that the best of these games had weren't all that great. Plant pot is pretty good because at least you can disambiguate different parts of speech for the same word, but it's when you get things like open box, okay, that works. Open door, no, you can't open the door because open is reserved for boxes. If you want to open the door, you have to say unlock, okay, unlock door, right? Lock door, okay, let's try and close the box. You can't close the box because close actually means get closer to somebody. You have to have something else for closing the box. So this kind of one verb per command thing, which was a real annoying. You used to have to play hunt the verb a lot in attention. That was something they should never have ever had because back in then it's quite easy to write a parser for imperative English sentences. It's not all that hard.
Part of the game is figuring out how to tell the computer what we want.
Like dungeons should be scary, dark, claustrophobic, uncomfortable. It's alien to what you're normally used to, like walking in a cave should not feel like walking down the school hall. And yet, the practice as it evolved in the early cave crawls were that dungeons and caves were like, pleasant strolls that, sometimes had instant death at the dead ends, but otherwise, pretty harmless, tame level places. And it became a weird feeling, I guess, that locations were presented in that way after a time, that they should be one thing but presented as something else.
At least for me personally, it's intimidating to be in front of thousands of people, all of which who have this opinion of your work, which may be positive, which may be negative. You gotta set yourself up to it, I think. You have to tell yourself, all right, there's going to be a bunch of people who are going to hate what you do no matter what. There's going to be a bunch of people who, even though you tried to create a sympathetic character right from the beginning, will see that guy as a weasel or something like that. And you're never going to be able to capture those people. At least for me, there's logistics of it, and trying to really understand that there's going to be a whole bunch of people who think that what you spent all this time on sucked. It's a little intimidating.
And so then the question, at what age should people write IF, might be a lot like the question, at what age should people write? Let them write badly as early as possible, and let them write more and better later. When I was first playing, it was enough to be told that something was about to happen to make me type quickly in response, which is interesting.
But what, don't you want to hear about the screwdriver story?
There's that whole thing about the screwdriver story, which I standardly ask all the employees.
I mean, it is I'm sure lots of people have had this experience, but I can only tell you about my experience. And I was at Queen's Beach, and with my wife, and as we're leaving Cranes Beach and walking back to the car, there I see, next to the boardwalk, I see a dirty, discarded screwdriver. And I got so excited. A screwdriver! And I grabbed it. I go, I've been looking for this screwdriver, or I've been looking for a screwdriver. And my wife says, why? I go, I can't remember. But I know I've been looking for the screwdriver, and I brought it back into the car and drove home. I'm like, yeah, now why was I looking for the screwdriver? And my wife said, well, pretty sure I have a screwdriver in the basement. Yeah, that's true. So why was I looking for a screwdriver? I know I was looking for a screwdriver. And after we got back home and I saw the Apple IIe, I go, right. I was playing a game. I was playing Planetfall or something, and I was looking for a screwdriver in the game. And it was just this bizarre experience to realize that something I was looking for in a game, I was now looking for outside in the real world, and that was just a really neat experience, and I know other people have had this experience too, but for me that was one of the great things about Infocom, is creating this alternate universe or alternate universes which somehow they bled into your real universe, and that was great.
I remember I had a great experience, which I couldn't really use in a story. I guess I could have, but I didn't. I created a box, and there were objects. A person was a mobile talking container, in terms of the system. But you could also have a container. A container was something that something else could be inside of, and you end up with a linked list of things that are inside of things. Well, when I had designed, an object that was a container, I created the red box. I had also the ability to take the red box and put it in something else, and then an object could contain something. And I would take one item and put it in another. That item could be put in the third, and so on. And at one point, I took the red box, and just to try it out, I said, put the red box in the red box. And so I put the red box in the red box. And then I said, look in the red box. And it said, in the red box, there is a red box. And the way it worked is it would keep looking, into the nested objects and containered objects and say, and then in the red box, there is a red box. And in the red box, there is a red box. And it went into this sort of infinite loop.
Interactive fiction has the potential to be better than literature. That's what I've kind of always felt and believed.
Literature that has all the elements of literature. Literature that has truly fine writers practicing the form and developing the form.
So yes, I thought of it as a game, and yes, I thought of it as a literary work.
Text adventure, it is a book. I'll go strongly. It is a book, just done a little differently.
It was a new art form. It was a new form of the literary arts.
I've read on the web. It's like, Zork 1, the Zork games really were not very well written stories, and really they failed the test of literature and this and that. And I laugh. It's hysterical because I didn't write it to be a story. There's no story.
Interactive fiction was a marketing term applied to text adventures in the early 80s.
It was puzzles. It was intended to be entertaining, and it was a technical exercise. And and say, well, it's very incoherent. There's like mythologies from all this, but it's like, yeah.
I don't think the fact that you interact with an environment and the objects in the environment, the fact that you read it doesn't make it fiction. Any more than interacting with graphical objects makes it a movie.
They kept saying, we should have one playing through of the game that you can publish as a book, Robert. And I would say, oh no, a book is very different from just a printout of one experience of the plot. I said, no, just publish it. And in a way, they were quite prophetic. We're in a period now where you see an ad on TV, and it's an ad for a sci-fi film that's also a game, or an adventure film that's also a game. And unless you're more sophisticated than I am, you have a lot of trouble telling whether you're looking at part of a video game or part of a film. And that blurring of genre was something that the programmers sort of took for granted.
You know, we used to say that the people who built the stages are writing the plays. So we used to look down our nose at people who were technical, who had no sense of what story was all about, attempting to use this medium, which we thought would, you know, would really redefine fiction. And we really believed that. So you had people who were technical trying to write stories. We thought really it has to come the other way. And the technology is in the service of the story and the characters and the richness of the world.
You know, it'd be nice if I had any idea about how to write, or had any idea, you know, that it mattered what the writing was like, because that just wasn't what interested me at the time. It was like, how do I build the tools and build the structure of the game so that I build this world like this? And I always loved the idea that then someone who's more talented than I am in writing could take this and do something that's really much better than I could do.
Writing is not easy for me. I was a programmer first. I started programming when the Apple II showed up. I didn't really start writing until college, and even then I was very slow at it because the school system had convinced me that writing was slow, painful, boring, and didn't really accomplish anything. It took me a long time to figure out that I actually did want to communicate.
I have tried to write a book, but I've done a few pages and looked at it and think to myself, boring, terribly boring, I won't bother.
And authors think that way, and they should. I mean, they think about, how do I tell the story to keep the person interested from chapter 1 to chapter 2 to chapter 3. So it's pacing and plotting and how the narrative's put together. I mean, all those things are critical. Then you bring them into this, where many things could happen at any time, and someone could do the same thing 50 times. And you're trying to make it has to have something for the people to do, and they have no idea.
As I understand it, this is entirely the wrong lamp. That this would not be used in most expeditions. Wouldn't be used, certainly not in the modern era, obviously, but I mean even going back.
This is exactly the kind of lamp that I first carried into Mammoth Cave at age 8. And, the cave was entirely lit by these. Plus, the guide had a large flashlight. I had a 5-cell flashlight, and the guide also threw torches up onto ledges in far distant places. This lantern is was invented by Dietz in about 1870. Kerosene came in about the same time, and so the early cave explorers didn't use anything like this. They had lard oil lamps, which were just terrible. They smoked, and they would burn your fingers if you held them wrong. This lamp gives a pretty good light, but the shade does soot up, and you have to keep cleaning it. So I don't know of anybody who uses this kind of a lamp in caving. But it does illustrate the fact that you have to have light. There is no natural light in a cave, except in some Western movies where people ride into a cave on horseback or ride into a mine, and lo and behold, there are mysterious lights that light up these mines and caves.
This is a wonderful brass lantern. It's beautiful, it's shiny, it's glittery, and it glows. It's not really at all close to being practical for crawling through a cave. One passage in Colossal Cave where you're crawling over cobbles, it's a 300-yard crawl, and this lamp wouldn't fit upright. You'd have to tip it sideways in order to make it fit. It is not at all practical to mount this on your head. And in the mid-70s, cavers typically wore a brass carbide lantern, and it's 2 chambers. The top chamber holds water, the bottom chamber holds a substance called carbide. Water drips down onto the carbide, and that creates a flammable gas which burns with a cheerful orange glow. It's wonderful to have in the cave because in caves it's chilly. You can warm your hands, you can cook your food with it, you can make marks on the cave wall with the burnt tip of the lamp, so it's a very practical thing to have.
Up until the Interactive Fiction Plus system was introduced with the Mindkribble Voyaging, you were limited to 255 objects. That was not just objects that you could pick up and carry around, but every room was an object. Anything that you wanted to refer to, was still an object. And that was limited to 255. And plus on top of that, the total vocabulary size, which would be nouns, plus verbs, plus prepositions, adjectives, etc. Even though there was no hard limit in the Infocom development system, individual personal computers kind of imposed a limit that resulted in kind of a de facto vocabulary limit of about 1,000 words. Often, someone would say, well, I tried referring to the umbrella as a bumbershoot, and it didn't know the word. And much as you'd like to add bumbershoot as a synonym for the umbrella, it just wasn't worth adding 10 bytes to the preload or whatever. Well, one thing about the original Zork is, the whole game had to be something like 78K to fit on what at that time was a limiting machine, which was the TRS-80 Model 1. 78K is, smaller than, a banner ad on a typical web page nowadays. To get the game to fit in 78K, the text had to be quite terse. Every now and then there'd be a set piece. You'd get to, the top of the cliff, and there'd be a description of the view of the falls and the rainbow. But for the most part, the room descriptions were things like, "You're west of a White House," or "This is a former broom closet." And out of necessity, the descriptions left a lot to the imagination, but because of that, the White House was never described in much detail. Even, how big was it? What architectural style was it? Was it new or run down, etc. Details like that were all left to people's imagination, and therefore the depiction of the White House in people's minds probably represented a much bigger spectrum of possible White Houses than would be the case if, say, Zork had been a novel rather than a computer game.
People are hungry for sensation and experience, and so if text is good, then text and graphics is better, and if graphics are good, then 3D graphics are better still, and if that's good, then networked is good, and if networked is good, massively multiplayer is better.
People want the more immersive ones that have graphics or that have more complex storylines.
We all know. Graphics sell at some level. As time went on and as graphics got better on some of these machines, that was a real worry. Not that the games are going to be better or more fun, but that it was going to be harder to sell our games.
When, we were doing kind of all, sort of the height of purity stuff, the Infocom unleashes the world's most powerful graphics generator with a picture of your brain. Or, would you shell out $1,000 to match wits with this? And, showing a picture of like a 8-color, 16 by 24 pixel alien. At that point, the graphics that you could do on a computer were so poor that, there was really no doubt in our minds that the text was superior.
We were rather dismissive of graphics. And I think there was a justification for being dismissive of graphics at first. But come 1988 or so, we were way behind where we should have been. When we first started experimenting with it, we started experimenting too late.
Would we have gone into graphics? We did. Would we have gone more into graphics? We were planning. Shogun shipped with graphics, and Journey had graphics. Years before that, we were doing Fliblitsky.
I think, I've forgotten who said this originally, but it was, if you spend several $1,000s for a computer with a color screen and a video card, and you want to display lots of pretty pictures, are you going to settle for a text adventure?
I'm no purist, and I thought it was kind of cool to see some of the efforts that they made to take the Zork universe in a graphical direction.
When creating a game like Doom, the focus is entirely you know, we're making a game that was supposed to kind of rely on base instinct, and the UI disappears, and there's just no thought. It's just pure reaction, and that is very much the opposite of what text adventure is, which is very, you know, sit there and you think and you puzzle over stuff. You try and figure out where things are, keep track of what you have. You know, all these, you know, very, very heavy thought process on a text adventure. And when we created Doom many years later, it was really completely opposite kind of play style.
What is it about your product that can beat other products, and that's what you got to go with. Infocom made exactly the wrong decision in trying to go into graphic adventures. I can understand the impetus, but the right solution would have been to make text adventures much, much smarter, and they didn't do that. So, great disappointment.
You can have a really intense interaction on a computer in multiple different ways. One where you're trying to be very thoughtful, just stare at the screen and look at the letters and, you know, try and understand what they mean and try and pull some other meaning out of those sentences, and then have another intense experience where you're just high on adrenaline, fear, running, shooting, you know, totally different thing.
I was getting so tired. I was getting overwhelmed with. I'll back up a little bit. I did the typing of answers for almost a year, and about maybe 3/4 of the way through that year, I went off to business school. I went to the University of Chicago. He basically made a proposal to Joel, you know, saying, you don't want to handle, you know, all these hint calls and stuff. Why don't you let me form a separate company called the Zerk Users Group, and I'll handle all that stuff, and I'll pay a royalty to Infocom. And so, in addition to inventing the Invisiclues hint booklets, he also sold maps, he sold t-shirt, iron-ons, he sold bumper stickers, he sold pins, buttons, probably other things that I'm forgetting now, and built that up into quite a business. And part of the deal of him coming back to Infocom was Infocom buying the Zerk Users Group and then taking, you know, all that stuff internally. I continued under Zork Users Group, providing the service, but you know, as a student, I had a fair amount of other things going on, and I was finding that it was taking more and more and more of my time to answer these questions. I could do it fast enough that it was fairly lucrative, but it was still getting to be a little tedious. So it also was clear that it was going to keep growing. So I was, you know, trying to think of a way to do a clue book that would not spoil the game for people. I didn't want to give anything away that you didn't want to know. Didn't want you in the course of perusing the book to see something that would spoil a problem for you, or, you know, spoil part of the game for you. That was one part of it. Another part of it, though, is I was really concerned that I'd do all this work and then it would just get Xeroxed and passed along or whatever. So I wanted something that was kind of hard to pirate. And I looked at a bunch of things. I looked at, like, scratch off, like they use for the state lotteries. I looked at, you know, the colored glasses, you know, where you use the multiple colors of ink and you can't see the answer, but then you'd still be able to see other answers on the same page. So there were, you know, possibilities of creating a little window that you slide over the question on the page and that kind of thing. I was at a party back in my hometown with some friends of mine from high school days, and one of them had gone to pharmacy school at University of Wisconsin, and I was describing that, you know, I was trying to create these booklets and trying to come up with an answer, and he said, well, why don't you use invisible ink? And now I actually had been printing for several years as a side job prior to Infocom, and I thought I knew a fair amount about printing. I'd never even heard of invisible ink. So I quizzed him on it, and he said, well, in pharmacy school, one of our professors used to do tests where he would give you the ability to develop the answer, so you knew as you were taking the test whether you got things right or wrong, and you actually learned in the process. And the more, like, be multiple choice, the more
choices you had to develop before you finally got to the right one, kind of the worse your score on that question. So it sounded like an intriguing idea, and I started calling around. I called printing journals, I called printing companies, I called, you name it, I called them, and everybody thought I was nuts when I asked them about this invisible ink process. And so I called him back and said, can you give me any more information about, even the professor's name? Maybe he can tell me where I can find this. So I ended up talking to the professor's assistant, and she went and found the box that the tests came in or whatever, and read something off the label that it was from A.B. Dick. And I called them and finally got through to somebody who didn't think I was a nut. And he said, oh, do you mean our latent image process? And I said, if that's what you call it. And so they finally put me through to somebody who knew what they were talking about, and I found a printer that actually had the technology and created the Invisiclues books.
I still remember the very first order we ever got for other than individual orders. I had put an ad in a magazine called, I think it was Softside, it's been a while now, where I was selling the Adventureland game. I got a call from a Radio Shack manager in Chicago. Keep in mind I was living down in the Orlando area, and he wanted to buy, I think it was 50 copies of Adventureland. And I said, actually my wife at the time talked to him, and she was all set to sell to him, and he wanted a price, and she quoted him 50 times the retail price, and he had to explain wholesale and how wholesale works and how he's supposed to get a discount so he could then sell it at retail. This is how new we were to what we were doing. So we got an order for 50 copies, and literally I had to hand make each cassette by hand. We shipped all the cassettes the same way we would the retail, with a little sheet of paper and the 50 cassettes to him, and he got it, and he says, where's the packaging? Okay, this is a problem. I've got a cassette tape. I don't have a lot of money right now. Keep in mind, I was working for a living, and I was doing this on the side. How am I going to come up with packaging? Okay, let me see. Let me see what plastic bags are. So I went to commercial bag makers, and I could buy 10,000 bags for, nominal fee of $200 or $300, and I was like, what? At this time, my daughter, my oldest daughter now, was a baby, and she was drinking from bottles. And there was something back then called it was a shell of a bottle, and inside you put a baby bottle liner. And you put the formula in, put the lid on. So when you got done, you threw away the liner. There was no bottles to wash. It was very hygienic. You didn't have to boil. Well, I took one of these baby bottle liners, just looking at it, and I dropped a cassette tape into it, and it fit. And I was, I'm onto something here. The top. I came up with the idea of a business card, a folding business card, that would then go over the top and be stapled, and I had the package. And then on the front, I had the business cards printed at a local printer fairly cheaply. I could do like 100 cards at a time. It had the Adventure National information on the front and the synopsis of the game on the back. I had a cassette label that went on the cassette. I don't remember if the labels were printed or I did them on my printer at the time. And there was my packaging. Oh, and drilled a hole through the card so it would hang on a pegboard. And that was the packaging.
It takes a long time to make interactive fiction. I think that is truly different from the norm, for one thing, but then also provides a satisfying experience for people.
If you're getting paid and you get to do it all the time, it's 9 months. And if you're not, then it's maybe a lot more, or a few years.
My first game, which is more of a traditional game and didn't have much innovative stuff in it, I probably worked on for 4 or 5 months, the last month being pretty solid, working on it in all my free time.
Working alone on Narcolepsy, which was, fairly straightforward, took 14 months.
My more complicated experimental game was 9 months of work with 2 solid months at the end of committing all my time and putting every ounce of effort I had into finishing that game.
It is so time intensive to put together a piece of interactive fiction that goes beyond the short story length.
Now, there are some people who work at it longer, 6 months. I've known a couple of cases where someone has written me and said, now, I haven't released it before, but I've been working on this game for 4 years. Is it okay if I enter it? And I'm like, okay.
Essentially, I am just waiting until I have a year to spare. As soon as I have a year to spare, I'm going to be back with some kind of really major project.
A lot of people have full-time jobs, and one of the reasons IF takes so long to write is because people have lives.
But I don't know when that will be. I don't even know if that will ever come to pass.
It went pretty slowly for the first 2 or 3 years of the writing of it, and then I lost my job and it went a lot faster.
It was a dungeon. The theme of the text adventure was it was like a dungeon crawl. There was a bunch of rooms, and I was basically just trying to be able to move between rooms, just learning how to use variables and print stuff to the screen and have some kind of program flow. And it was not the adventure did not get very long because I was having to put them on punch cards because I didn't have an account. So I had to save them on something, paper tape or punch cards, and I was doing them on punch cards. And after I had about, I think it was 300 cards, which is there's a line of basic per card. I was going home one day and the cards all fell off the back of my bike into a bunch of water, and I was like, done. I'm not using cards anymore. I'm going to wait for discs.
But I had this one just heartbreaking case of a woman who wrote me and said, I have lupus, and there are very few things that I can do because of my condition. I can't really go outside all that often. I can't do any sports or exercise or things like that. It's really crippling. I can't play newer computer games, even though I'm holed up inside because it takes too fast reaction times, and my condition keeps me from doing that. But I can play adventure games, and I've been playing adventure games for all of these years, and I'm really excited that you're writing about these adventure games. And I'm moving into a new apartment where I can't keep all of these games that I have been, that I bought and I played. I want to send these to you because I've heard you talk about the fact that you collect these games. Will you take these from me? And I was just floored that somebody, just out of the blue, someone I didn't know, had been affected enough by what I had been doing that they were like, here, please, take these from me. You can have them. And I was just astounded.
I think the reason why people have continued approaching me on issues of game design arises from the fact that I say what people in their guts know is right, even though they don't like hearing it. I've often been called the conscience of the games industry or whatever. But the fact is, I say unpleasant things that many other people in the games industry secretly know are true, but they don't like saying them out loud. And I have reached a position where I'm immune to the criticism that attends saying such things. So I can get away with saying them. People, not things. Games should be about people. And they aren't. They're about objects, things. You chase things, you shoot things, you acquire things, you gobble things, you run from things, but it's always things. And games need to address human concerns. And until they do that, they're going to remain of little real significance. The genre started off with enormous potential. It was very simple at first, just text and branching. But it could have become gigantic because the basic structure was so clean and simple. All they needed to do was to add smarter branching to permit a richer kind of behavior. And unfortunately, text adventures never went beyond the simple Boolean branching narrative. It's a shame. The grammars used in the interactive fiction stuff I've seen are still very primitive. We could be doing so much more there. So, interactivity is important because it meets the needs of the human mind so much better than anything else. And that's why we have to pursue interactivity. Initially, that was done by a very simple yes or no type of thing. Has he gotten the key to the door? Has he already told off the wombat? Very simple types of questions that yielded very simple answers. The first step should have been an arithmetic decision-making. Does she like him enough? And of course that requires us to keep track of how much she likes him. And that in turn requires arithmetic calculations, equations. And text adventures never made that transition, which greatly limited the richness of behavior. That's the value of interactivity. It engages the human brain far more powerfully than any of the other media. But it only does so if the designer does a good job with the interactivity. If the interactivity is primitive, then you don't get much engagement. You want to design interactivity that really reaches out and grabs the student. Think of it in terms of a one-on-one conversation with a teacher. Imagine how much you would learn from a teacher who simply talk, lectures at you, and you ask a question, he ignores your question and just continues the lecture. Well, that's not very effective at all. Imagine by contrast the ideal teacher who starts off asking you a question and then just proceeds to continue to ask you more questions that develop your thinking on the problem, and lo and behold, at the end of this Socratic dialogue, you have produced the answer out of your own head. The teacher didn't tell you anything, he just evoked the truth from you. Good interactivity is the same way. It should give the player the greatest opportunity to be himself, to express himself, to say the things he wants to say that are relevant to whatever message you're trying to communicate. And for that, you need a lot more nuance certainly than the text adventures give you, or even that the games give you. And I've been hammering at this point for decades, and that has earned me the ire of a great many game designers, because in fact it's a very difficult problem. People are immensely more complicated than guns or bullets or this kind of thing. And so writing or designing games that address these issues is a much tougher problem.
I don't know when you first kind of bumped into text adventure like stuff. I don't know if you bumped
1979. No, earlier. 77. Very first stuff, adventure.
Do you remember having any thoughts about that? Understanding it was 30 years ago.
I was very impressed. And actually for me the most exciting moment came when I encountered work by Rob Zdybel. Now there's a name for you, spelled Z-D-Y-B-E-L. And he had, Rob, and he had written an adventure game generator, a tool, an editor you could use to write text adventures. It was very clever. It was one of the first, and it was good. And I played around with it and did some stuff with it, and I was very impressed with the potential of that medium. And I was also enormously impressed with the potential for expansion of the medium. That is, he had slapped together something in BASIC in like a week's time. And I realized, my God, if you went to work with this thing and built a really good one, you could do all sorts of fabulous things. It's just that at that time, the whole world was opening up. I mean, there were a million fabulous things that could be done with these personal computers, and you couldn't do everything. I picked a number of things to pursue, but that sadly was one that I did not pursue. So it's a shame. That was a very exciting time.
I joined DEC in 1977 and almost immediately walked into the culture of text adventures on the large time-sharing systems. The particular one that was sort of sweeping DEC at the time was Will Crowther's Adventure. In fact, it was such a burden to the time-sharing systems of the era that it had been banned from being played during prime time. We were going into prime time hours, we were going to shut down all the games. And there was a capability to find all the copies of the games and shut them down more or less simultaneously. It's part of the culture of computing in the 70s that is now unfathomable. I never saw the main machine. It was in a large computer room. It required special air conditioning. These machines are, scale-wise, the equivalent of today's mainframe computers. Multiple cabinets, disk drives that were smaller than the flash cards you're using to record on were the size of washing machines and required 208 power. So imagine that your personal computer was upscaled to the size of an 18-wheeler truck and then downscaled in power and a computing capability to about what's in a modern calculator. And that's what we had at the time. So my thought was to get it off the mainframe, off the time-sharing system, and onto the smallest possible mini-computer that was widely accessible inside of DEC, which was the PDP-11. Because then anybody would be able to play it at any time. And of course that included me. Adventure is not that hard a game to work out, the original text adventure. But I was extremely interested in how it had been put together to get the effects it did. It gave, for its era, a very realistic interactive feel. So I really wanted to understand them, and what better way to understand them than to port it from a large-scale environment to a small one. It became accessible to the Fortran to C converters that had started showing up in the Unix world to help people cope with the fact that in that era of Unix there were no Fortran compilers, or no good Fortran compilers. And at the end, they had truly portable code. Unreadable, but portable. And it's those C versions of Adventure and Dungeon that basically now populate the universe of these things. I was astounded that we're building an embedded control plane application here on UC Linux. And on this relatively tiny microprocessor, and the developer booted up the UC Linux board, and the first thing he found there was Adventure.
I do want to do a lot of comparison after the fact, and I think that's something I'm only starting to work towards now, where I'm looking at similar games where all these games had a bathroom, or all these games had a town, village, you know, and just being struck by how many of them have like a fountain in the middle of them. It's all the same village, you know. Very few weather vanes in games. Why not? Just you get to see repeated themes. Okay, here's a dog. That means there has to be a bone around here to feed it, to get rid of it, because that's what you do with dogs in games. There's a rat, find the cheese. There's a monkey, find the banana. You start to recognize that, coal mine, find make a diamond. It just gets really bizarre, feather, Okay, is this meant to tickle somebody? And if it's not for tickling, what's it good for? Is it a pen? Because feathers sometimes are pens. And if it's a pen, then you have to find what's being used for ink. You start recognizing that what can be done with all the different objects, all the puzzles involving mirrors, all the puzzles involving bells. I Gunther was right. I'm obsessive about comparing all this stuff and collating it all. And like I said, I'm just starting to figure, I think, some of these things out. What's sort of like I don't even have a word for it yet. I guess the common experience or the common physics of IF.
So I think you described what I did as translating the adventure game idea from one medium to another, because you could call text adventure games a medium because the output to the player is text descriptions. The player types text commands to the game. That's all there is. There's no graphics, there's no sound, there's no animation, right? And so the medium that I was translating it to was a video game where you had a joystick for input, one button, and the 4 directions, or 8 directions, if you want to think of it that way. And it had graphics, had color, had animation, it had sound. So it had to change. This was back in the very ancient early days of video games, so the resources were amazingly limited on the old Atari 2600 console. So you had very crude, low-resolution graphics, and you had a tiny amount of memory, 4K, 4096 bytes of ROM. That had to include the whole program and all the graphics and all the sound. Not very much, 4K. And the amount of RAM that was available for your variables was 128 bytes, 1/8 of a K. So that was another set of limitations. The processor wasn't very powerful. It was a 1 megahertz 6502 8-bit processor. So that was just another set of limits, is to translate the text adventure game into the video game medium in this tiny little early system was challenging. And you had to, it wasn't easy. You had to have the right idea. There are a lot of things you couldn't do, but it worked. As far as Atari was concerned, the reason that my game on the 2600 and Don Wood's and Willie Crowther's game were both called Adventure was because my working title was, guess what, Adventure. And then when it came time that I suppose the legal looked at it, and the thing that I had modeled my game off of, Colossal Cave Adventure, was in the public domain, so it could just be called Adventure. One thing I tried to do when I was first trying to adapt the idea onto the video game medium was I did what you might call attempt to transliterate features from Colossal Cave Adventure into Atari Adventure. I made a maze of twisty little passages where you go off this way and come back that way, where if you went off this way, you didn't come back into the same room. I made a confusing maze, but it didn't work. It was too confusing. You know, translators that go from French to English have to make some adjustments, right? Well, so I had to make some adjustments. There were some things that just didn't work if you translated them literally. That was one. There was a crystal bridge that spanned a giant chasm. Well, I ended up having a bridge in Atari Adventure. The bridge crossed walls because I had maze walls. Well, the crystal bridge was just a way to get past one obstacle and had a solution. Whereas what was sort of inspired by that in Atari Adventure was this movable bridge that you could use to cross any wall. So that was sort of different than the original model. How do you carry around objects? Okay. Well, I think I came up with a pretty good solution, and it changed
how things worked, because in Colossal Cave you had an inventory that had a bunch of objects in it, and you could type inventory and then it would tell you what you had, and you could carry up to 7 objects, if I remember right. And I tried to do that at first on Atari Adventure. I had an inventory screen and objects would appear in it, but I found that was really stupid, because you were in this real-time thing with the dragon chasing you, and then you went into your adventure screen, and did everything freeze? Did time stop? Did the dragon freeze in midair? Well, that's not right. Well, did the dragon eat you while you were looking at your inventory? Well, that doesn't work very well either. So neither of those were very palatable alternatives. So what I finally ended up doing was I got rid of the inventory screen. I just made an arbitrary limit that you could only carry one object at a time, and showed it next to you. And that you stayed in real time. It made the user interface simpler, and it gave you choices. Like if you had a treasure and a weapon, you had to decide which one to carry. In a lot of ways, I was just lucky to be there in the right place at the right time, and I don't know, I guess it was just intuitive leap, you could say. The idea of rooms, a network of rooms with objects in them, and some creatures in some of the rooms, it was just clear to me you could do a video version of that.
The GRU was actually invented by Jack Vance, who, in my opinion at least, is one of the greatest science fiction and fantasy writers ever. He wrote a series of stories set billions of years in the future. They're collectively known as the Dying Earth series, because the sun is about to go out. And there are all these strange monsters that wander around, and there's magic, and it's actually a very Zorkish kind of environment. There's a lot of tongue-in-cheek humor and a lot of sarcasm, which there's a little of in Zork. And one of the monsters that wanders around is a thing called a GRU. Now, Jack Vance's GRUs are nothing like the GRUs in Zork, but the name, that's where the name comes from. They came into Zork because when we first wrote the game, it was a lot like Adventure. If you wandered around in the dark, you would fall in a pit. However, that meant that you could fall in pits in the attic of the house, you could fall in pits in dark places where there couldn't possibly be a pit. And after a while, I just said, look, we're not going to have pits, we're going to have something that kills you. We're going to have a monster. And I thought for a while, and I came up with, okay, it's going to be called a GRU. And the rest is either history or comedy. For a while, it was almost explicit policy that every game had to have a GRU in it. Even Suspect, which was a real-world, present-day murder mystery, had a horse that was a racehorse that was owned by one of the suspects called Lurking Gru. So there was definitely a certain. It was a MacGuffin. It was a motif. It was a thing that we kept doing over and over because we thought it was amusing.
Photopia is an example of a game that doesn't really have puzzles. It's questionable as to whether it's a game, and I don't think Adam Cadre would call it that.
I happened to be up against it with another game, and I had been, of course I'm nervous about all the other people. How good is my game? How's it going to be received? So I'm playing through them, and it's like, oh, that's crap, that's pretty good. I don't know, that's about on my level. And then I hit Photopia, and it's like, this is something completely different.
There are these disconnected perceptions and perspectives that we have to put together to see the story of one particular girl by going through these different interactive fiction worlds, seeing what's happening there, and assembling everything.
This is so far and away beyond what we're doing over here that it was very obviously, at least in my mind, going to place, if not very high. I was expecting it to place first, but at least place very high. So I think that's a case where it was far and away beyond what the other games in the competition were doing.
Photopia took 6 weeks because, again, it is short story sized, and the types of interaction that it allows are fairly, tightly restrained. You can interact within certain limits, but that's really all you get. I walked out of the suite hereafter, and I wanted to come up with something that was more literary and trying to be beautiful rather than something that's full of puzzles and trying to be a challenging game. It's not like I just sort of made up a story trying to produce an emotional reaction. It's like when I thought about what is it that I have within myself to share with people. One of the things that I wanted to try to evoke was the feeling of my own sister's death back many years ago.
Photopia was certainly a touchstone for the interactive fiction community. Got a lot of people talking. The fact that it was undeniably a serious story. It was one in which the player did not have the freedom to prevent a tragic occurrence. That was really the heart of that experience.
So he did not come from it as sort of an exercise in nostalgia or an exercise in trying to recapitulate what had happened before. He was coming at it as a completely new art form.
It was hard to deny that there was something interactive fiction-like going on in this, and it got people thinking along a number of dimensions about what IF could do.
To the extent that people were moved by Allie's death, it wasn't just me saying, haha, score! I managed to produce this emotional effect. Look at what a master of the, literary arts I am.
It's still an ending that many people find shocking because they don't expect the story to end at that particular point.
I was sharing, a pretty deep part of my emotional life with people, and the fact that Photopia and the medium of interactive fiction allowed me to do that in a way that a lot of other media couldn't, is pretty significant when I think back about on the things that I've done, creatively speaking.
After I finished playing the game and realized what had happened, I replayed the game trying to do something about it, and of course there's nothing to do. And I replayed it again, and I realized that at the very beginning of the game, you start off and you're a passenger in a car, and this is the car that's destined to crash into the other car and kill the girl. But you can demand to be let out of the car and left on the side of the road, and the car speeds off without you and goes off on its date with destiny. But you weren't there. You didn't have to do it yourself. And that was the only thing I got out of Photopia that I could actually had control over, and it let me do it, actually. And there's actually another part in the game later on where you hear a snippet of conversation in the hospital. So the line "drunk frat boys" shows up. And when I replayed the game all the way up to that part again, just so that they wouldn't say "drunk frat boys," but they would say "drunk frat boy," because I wasn't in the car. There was only one guy left. And it actually, I played it, and I was all excited to get rid of that S, and it was still there, and I was so disappointed, and I sent it in as a bug report. It's like, if I get out of the car, that S should be gone. And that's my contribution to the story, is to delete an S from one word.
Complicity, especially with what Lucian was talking about, vis-a-vis whether you can get out of the car at the beginning of the program. You may not actually save Allie, but at least you are not as directly complicit as somebody who is actually in the vehicle that kills her.
So what I did in my own head was I since all you hear is drunk frat boys, then the unheard context is then what I could change in the story in my head. Was someone no longer is saying drunk frat boys crashed into the car, but they are saying, oh, it must have been one of those drunk frat boys or something like that. But it wasn't me. I didn't do it.
No, in the first adventure, Adventureland, there was a bear. And I remember in my original version of the game, the bear fell off the ledge and died. And you get down on the bottom of the ledge and you find a dead bear. And I either got a letter or somebody talking to me saying, you know, that really put me off to find out I killed that bear while I was playing this. Why did you make me kill the bear? And so I redid the game and put in a slightly woozy, stunned bear down at the bottom. And then after that, I did not want to put the player in a situation where they were feeling uncomfortable playing the game. The bear also has an interesting story behind it, which I don't think I've ever... I may have related it in some interviews. I don't know if I've ever done it on film, certainly. My original game, because of the constraints, I was in a 16K interpreter. I would only use 3 letters of the English language for each word I would put in there. So in the interpreter, if you wanted to yell at the bear, or you could scream at the bear, you can do, you know, holler at the bear. These were all ways to startle the bear to get him fall off the ledge, so you get him out of the way. I'd use 3 letters, so I'd have HOL, I'd have SCR, I'd have YEL as the verb that I wanted you to use on the bear. Well, I got a letter a few years later, and it was kind of funny. They said, we're playing with the bear, and we got so upset with it. We tried to push the bear. We tried to tickle the bear. We tried to do everything with that bear, and finally we just said, screw bear. Game replies, bear is so startled he falls off the ledge.
I didn't think of it as, I mean, that's a name that was applied to it later. Right. To me, it was my signature. The context was each of those games for the Atari 2600 was done by one person. I was kind of proud of that game. It was a good idea. It was hard to implement. My boss told me it was impossible and not to do it, but I managed to get around him. So I had to solve some political problems and some technical problems, and then it was just going to be Adventure by Atari, and that pissed me off. So I hid my signature in it. And you know, there is a tradition of artists putting their name down in the corner. So that's what it was to me. It was just my name down in the corner of the painting. The puzzle of how to get to the secret room, well, it had to be hard or else it might have been discovered before it got sent out into the world. And why did I use the dot? Well, I'm not sure this was conscious, but I think in retrospect that there's a bit of irony there, because the dot was just 1 pixel in size. It was an object that was as little as possible. It's like an insignificant little glitch, little piece of dirt. But yeah, it was significant. It let you get someplace you couldn't get to otherwise. So it was kind of like, pay no attention to that little man behind the curtain kind of thing.
Well, I mean, I think the best example of that is the character Floyd, the robot in Planetfall, you know, who at the time just, you know, completely impressed people as being such a realistic and deep and character who they cared about. In those days, pretty much all that I read was science fiction. So that was, you know, kind of a given that when I did a game that it would be a science fiction game. And then kind of the second major focus of Planetfall is the main character of Floyd, the robot. Just got to that point, you know, thinking, okay, if I'm gonna, you know, sort of put so many eggs in the basket of Floyd, creating a character that I hoped would be very believable and someone who the player would build an emotional connection with, what's the best way to cash in on that connection, so to speak? And I thought, well, the, you know, most emotional thing that you could do with a character that you have a strong connection with is to cause that character to die.
That's really all it came from. And that was, the idea of Floyd having to die, toward the end of the game was in my thinking from the very beginning. Once you've saved the planet and the people on the planet have been revived, they repair Floyd and he comes to life again. That was definitely at the urging of players and people at Infocom, who didn't want the ending to be too downer, too sad.
And then it's like you stop seeing all the descriptions of Floyd, and it's like, man, he's gone, and it feels quieter, and it's just incredible what you can communicate with just text.
And a couple of years ago, for a talk that I was doing, I went and segregated all the code that had to do with the interaction between the player and Floyd, and printed that out. And it was, my recollection is, it was between 5 and 10, just 8.5 by 11 pages, in sort of reasonable point size. So the amount of stuff in the code that went into creating the character of Floyd, there was not a lot of complexity there. One of the beauties of Infocom and the sort of bag of tricks that it came up with was the fact that it really maximized the trick of making you believe that the little virtual world that we'd created was really, really deep, and that virtually anything that you tried would be handled.
Now the player can do 3 things. First, you had to find the cheeseburger in order to get rid of the guard robot.
Acquire the means to knock out the priest, you steal the crown, you get in your time travel machine.
But then you've got this chocolate arm.
And what you have to do is you have to put a timber across the mouth of the slide and tie rope to it.
And then you push it again and it moves, and you push it again, all of a sudden it doesn't move.
Each cell in it rotates based on the Fibonacci sequence as you go through it, and it's got hundreds of knobs and pulleys.
You have to understand an obscure fact about an obscure thing to be able to get it easily.
But there was absolutely no indication if you put one thing on it that you were going down the right path.
I think he had to jump off the bridge in the end. He just give up and jump into the river.
And it turned out that way back at the beginning of the game, when it asks you your name, just so it has a name to refer to you by, you think, it turns out if you give the name of Brenda Starr's lover, that this is an essential thing to do, because at some point to get full score in the game, you're going to have to eat that black orchid to cure some disease you've picked up. And if you haven't given that name, it kills you because it's poisonous to anyone else.
So, A Mind Forever Voyaging is a game where you actually play a computer with a consciousness, and your job as this computer is to simulate 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years into the future what the world around you is going to be like after a particular politician's policies are put in place. The way that it works is you are the simulator, but you're also a character in the simulation. It's a bit hard to describe, but there's multiple levels of character. The outermost level is you're this computer that does this simulation. But when the simulation begins, you are a human within the small town that you're simulating.
You could wander around this seemingly vast city and just explore and see how things changed over time. And certainly to me, that was a heck of a lot more interesting than, fixing spaceships and so forth.
You have a girlfriend and you have a job and you have these various you have a life within this simulation. You're asked to go into the simulation that's 10 years in the future from now and see what life is like after these policies have been put in place. You're asked to do it 20 years from now, and then 30 and 40 years from now. And the situation where these authoritarian measures have been sort of put in place, and that is what is improving life in the short term. And then as it gets later and later into the simulation, life degenerates and it becomes more of a police state.
I mean, it's a completely different approach to the game and the storytelling, in that you're sort of playing in this role of jumping into different environments and then coming out and see how you affect events. And that's a really cool game design, which I'd love to see brought into more games today.
I wouldn't have been aware enough at the time, just being out of high school, to recognize social political commentary if it had hit me upside the head. I just thought it was a fascinating premise. To me, it was good science fiction, right? I wouldn't have been able to tell the difference between good science fiction and social commentary. So I can't offer a perspective other than saying, it was enjoyable writing. I enjoyed playing it.
And very different from the usual vein of his. He does usually more comedy, silly, either science fiction or fantasy kind of games, but this was very serious. I suppose you could call it social satire, but it was really social commentary.
Remember Woody Allen movie Interiors? It was sort of his first serious movie after all his comedies. Hollywood, Dave Anderson, who was the head of testing while I was doing A Mind for Voyaging, he would often refer to it as Steve Maretsky's Interiors. Where it came from was kind of, a growing realization that people playing these games were just really obsessed by them. They'd be on your mind even when you weren't playing. And it was something that would be on your mind not just, for a day or two, but for weeks or even months. If a movie can change people's minds, because they focus on it for a couple hours and then maybe think about it for the next day or two, then so much more for a game. Simultaneously, this was, Reagan had just been reelected by a landslide, despite, in my opinion, him being the worst, or perhaps behind Nixon as the second worst president of my lifetime. And so those two, kind of brain threads converged on the idea of using an Infocom game to try to change people's minds about what was going on in the country politically.
A Mind for Voyaging is a piece that's very, very influential to me. It's interesting because it's a complete commercial failure. It was the first of the Interactive Fiction Plus games with new hardware requirements that came out from Infocom. It wasn't exactly in the typical genre lineup that Infocom had, and it was a flop, as far as I can tell, commercially.
Its reception was definitely mixed. A lot of the rabid, puzzle-loving fans did not like it. They might have liked the politics, or maybe they didn't like the politics, but some people did not like the lack of puzzles. But for me, it was like, great, look, we can really elicit an emotional response, and an emotional response which isn't trite.
But it also really worked to show this transformed environment over time, to present a political critique, to show how it could be that conservative policy dealing with immigration, security, and so forth might look good 10 years into the future, and yet might lead to long-term decline. And then at the same time, it was posing interesting sorts of questions, not that they were completely new to science fiction, but interesting sorts of questions about computer consciousness and the fact that the main character was a simulated person, a computer system, who was able to enter the simulated real world of this interactive fiction and explore it was, an additional, very intricate, fascinating aspect on top of all these other things.
So that was my mission with A Mind for Voyaging. I wanted to, kind of to show people, what a warmongering, Christian right pandering, environmental trashing, rights trampling asshole Reagan was. And of course, the game was so successful, we've never had another president like that.
We found all of these kinds of interesting bugs as a result of this network of objects.
When you climbed the tree that you had to climb to get to the control room, if you were on top of the tree, there was code that said, anything that you throw when you're on top of the tree, print the name of object sails, into the underbrush below and is lost forever, and then remove that object from the game. And so if you said throw hands, the hands, sail into the underbrush below and are lost forever. And then any time subsequent to that in the game, if you tried to say, unlock, door with hands or dig with hands or whatever, it would say you don't see the hands here.
So that was kind of fun for us. I mean, every once in a while, we'd find a bug where you put something in a container, and then you put that container in another container, and it disappears.
And you're looking for everything from misspellings to, bugs. You try everything twice, and, you get the response of you pick something up, and it says you're now holding the gun, and then you say pick up the gun, and it says you're now holding the gun, so obviously something's wrong there. On to other things like logic or something in the map didn't make sense. And then also, is it too hard? Is it too easy? All those things.
Eventually we had a team of people testing, doing nothing but trying to, feed the table to the lamp.
The more kind of nastier bug to actually track down, the one that probably is the more painful one for a QA person, is I screwed up something way back early in the game and now I can't finish. What happened to that object? I destroyed it. I hit it with a hammer, I stabbed it with the sword, it's dead, and I need this now, 3 hours later, somewhere else in the game, and I don't have this anymore.
The more of those things that you really want to handle, the more cases you have to handle. And it becomes very open-ended. And what you're going to end up doing, I always thought, the problem was going to be you ended up much more with the guess the word problem. If all of a sudden you can ask any question, but there really are only 3 questions that are important to the story, you're either going to spend all this time coming up with answers that don't mean anything, or you're going to have a lot of I don't know that, which is frustrating. And I always suspected it was a dead end.
Once you get into the mode of coding, you're just flying through it, and you know what you need to do, and you're putting the text on top of it, and you're creating all the objects and all that. And it's when you stop playing through it, and you give your first, release to your first round of beta testers, and you get all these bugs back, and you go, holy cow. That's probably the most time-consuming, and that's the piece I think a lot of authors don't appreciate. Maybe not a lot of authors don't appreciate, but they might not understand if they're first-time authors, that once you finish coding a game, you're only halfway done. Once your beta testers get it and make recommendations of this should be worded this way, this puzzle, you need a different way to solve it, that's where the extra time comes in.
The biggest fight I can think of between the game writers and marketing was over the title of the third game in the Enchanter trilogy. The first 2 games in that trilogy were entitled Enchanter and Sorcerer, and Dave wanted to call the third game Mage, just as another name for a wizard. And marketing was pushing for the name Spellbreaker, which of course is ultimately what it did end up being called.
Yeah, that was one of the instances where the business side and creative side did not agree, and it was hard to find a compromise there. How do you compromise on, I think the name ought to be this, I think the name ought to be anything but that?
The title Mage was too few letters and wouldn't, quote, pop on the package. And furthermore, that a large number of people didn't know what the word mage meant.
I was viewed as the enemy on the problem with Mage, from my point of view, was I showed it to people, and most people mispronounced it. I would get Madge, and I would get Maj. And actually, of the folks I showed it to, I think a majority mispronounced it. And to me, that's just a kiss of death with a name, with a brand name, as if a lot of people don't know how to say it.
Mage? Who wouldn't know what Mage is? I guess maybe 20 years ago we didn't know what Mage. Maybe I didn't know what Mage was or something. But Mage just seems like such an obvious title now.
But no, I was the one. There were a lot of other names that I could have gone with, And I think Spellbreaker was the one we all compromised on. But I just really felt that it was a mistake to call it something that people couldn't pronounce.
I think Dave was looking for me to back him up, and I said, I think this is a marketing call. I'm sure Dave was disappointed. I know Dave was disappointed, and hopefully the game didn't suffer too many sales because of it.
And as you know, I think they put in 1 in 100 times you boot it up, it comes up Mage.
What stood out about the Infocom games at the time were that they just went on and on and on and on, and you wondered how. I mean, if you had some technical knowledge and some understanding of what the disk capacity was, and you cared to count characters, you wondered how is it possible that they got so much text on a disk.
The time we first had the idea, I think it was my crazy idea, to port Zork from the mainframe world to get it on this TRS-80 Model 3. The question was, how are we going to get it on this machine that has 32K of RAM and an 80K disk drive when the game was well over a megabyte?
So not only were they able to put 400K on a 150K disk, but they also used virtual memory, which meant that the program itself could extend beyond the bounds of what you would expect out of a 32K of RAM Apple system. They were really pushing the bounds of what you could do on a microcomputer.
The Z Machine was not a revolutionary idea, considering that it came out of MIT, and it came out of MIT students who were familiar with P-code and that sort of low-level design specification, because what you had was a bunch of people who had started out writing games in essentially Lisp that took a mainframe, these enormous high technology, state-of-the-art things, and then they got together, and I'm sure you've talked to these people already, or you're going to. These people got together around a coffee table and said, okay, what it's going to take to squish this down to run on eensy-weensy home computers in today's market. Can we figure this out? Of course we can figure this out. We're MIT students.
What are things a language has to do? Well, a language, you're going to need to add and subtract things because people are going to have scores.
It'll run on 8-bit computers.
So you're going to need to have a little math. You're going to need to be able to jump around.
Read-only memory so that we can swap stuff in from disk or from cartridge or from tape or whatever it got. Only knows the thing's going to be running on.
And then there are going to be a bunch of things that are very specific to the game, like the idea of here's an object, and an object may have a container, and and an object has some properties. It may have a weight, and it may have this and that. So you put together a language that was oriented, that was designed specifically to do adventure game-ish things. So you're making it as compact as it could be, and that's really where it started from.
What else do we need? We don't really need anything else. Well, I mean, sure, we're going to have to be reading in commands. That's just a string of letters. We need to split it up into words. We need to look up the words in a table. Tables are easy. That's as far as they got, and they realized they had everything they needed.
One of the biggest advantages of Infocom's technology was platform independence. Back in that time, instead of having 2 or 3 or 4 different kinds of operating systems, there were about 30 different kinds of computers being sold, and each had its own operating system. There was a base interpreter that all of the games that Infocom sold used. Once you wrote this interpreter for a platform, every game that Infocom had written would the same day run on that computer, which was business-wise brilliant, and enabled Infocom to sell their games over this huge variety of systems. Likewise, the day that a game was finished, it would run on every computer that had a finished interpreter.
Nowadays, every gaming device or any PDA, you name it, microwave oven with a keypad, somebody will write an interpreter that will run the library of games. So that's I think the main thing that has really helped to keep those games alive and in the public eye, long after other games that were popular back in the early 80s have disappeared.
With respect to having virtual machines, the modern game industry has already done it, because the modern game industry has middleware now that enables us to make games faster by using things like the Unreal Engine or the Half-Life engine, just as Text Adventures had the Z Machine way back then. So we have learned, in fact, from the benefit of the benefit of having middleware that enables us to make games faster and concentrate more on the content and less on the code.
So it turned out what we were doing was very state-of-the-art at the time. Again, I mean, the irony is, I think we were just searching for the best solution to a very specific problem.
I mean, what you should do is just, insert here a close-up of just a little piece of code from the game.
It was a real programming language. It was not particularly easy to learn.
It was presented to me that way, as we have this development environment, this development system. Anybody can use it, and it's just crying out for a writer. Why don't you have a whack at it? That was not the case. It was not the truth. It wasn't anywhere near reality.
Pretty much everybody who began writing a game at Infocom started with a previous game. Usually you'd say, of all the games that have been written so far, which one is closest to mine?
That's how I learned it, and that's how Moresky learned it, and all the others. Just by taking code fragments and studying it and compiling it and seeing how it didn't work and banging your head on the table and repeat until exhausted, but eventually you become an implementer and you've learned it.
But I mean, particularly in terms of like an object definition or a room definition, even someone who didn't know anything about the code could fairly easily pick it up and start to make sense of it.
Even the president of the company had written an interpreter for the PDP-11, Joel Perez. So everybody coded, and so coding was kind of second nature to them. It was just like speaking English. There were comments and named variables like GWIM, which was get what I mean.
We brought in a guy who wrote for Scientific American, I think. Again, this is a long time ago. And we said, oh, this is great. He's a science writer. He's into tech. We'll hire him. He had some ideas for stories. And the thing with him was, we showed him the system. We'd help him. And one day we found him curled up under his desk.
It's like in Text Adventures, they work very much like the astral plane. On the astral plane, time, it's a line, but it's more like a videotape. You can kind of go back and forth. And I remember I just had this one really lucid dream where I was walking around and I was in a building, and all of a sudden it became like a text adventure, and it was literally like I was the parser and the player, and I was kind of the parser, and it would say you're at the top of the stairs, open door, get through door, and I knew that there was about to be something dangerous. I had a choice. I guess I could go down the stairs or do something, and I just typed save, and I was like, I just saved my position. And I went down the stairs, and something happened. I don't know, I started seeing some fire or something coming at me, and I restored, and it restored me back not only to the space, but also to the time before it had happened. And then I took the other path. And so, I think there's something very effective about the text adventure.